I went to a nearby restaurant and sitting at the bar watching the NBA game between the Thunder and the Pacers. And I was pretty much done, getting ready to leave. I'd already paid my bill. And a man comes up to me and asks me if the seat next to me is vacant. And I said, no, you're sitting there, smiling. He smiled, sat down. Interesting guy, nice guy. We had a few minutes of conversation. For coordinates, he was about 45, maybe 50, white guy. And I could tell he'd had maybe a drink or two before he got there. He even said he'd been at another bar. He wasn't slurry or anything, sloppy or anything like that, but you could just tell he had had a couple of pops. And as I was getting ready to leave, I said, now you be careful when you're driving. And he said, well, I really don't have to be that careful when I'm driving, but you have to be careful when you're driving. And I said, what do you mean by that? He said, well, I'm white, and if I'm driving erratically and I get pulled over, I can probably talk my way out of it. If you're driving erratically because you're black, you're probably going to get a ticket, if not go to jail. And I said, you mean you believe that the police are racist against black people? And he said, you don't? And I said, no, I really don't. That hasn't been my experience. And he was stunned by that. And I said, do you know any cops? And he said, yeah, he does. And I said, and what do you think of them? He said, well, the ones I know are fine. I said, it's just the ones you don't know. And he said, yeah, I guess. And he said, you don't believe that the police treat you as a black person worse than they treat me as a white person. I said, frankly, it's the opposite. And I said, the police are more hesitant, more reluctant to use deadly force against me than they are against you. He goes, I just don't believe that. And I said, let me ask you a question. How would you describe yourself ideologically? He said, what do you mean? I said, are you liberal? Are you a centrist? Are you a moderate? Are you very liberal? He said, well, I hate Donald Trump's guts if that's what you're asking me. I said, actually, I wasn't asking you that. He goes, how do you feel about Trump? And I said, that's a longer conversation. Can we just finish up this point here first? And he said, sure. And I said, so you believe that the police are essentially out to get black people? He said, well, there have been a lot of shootings. He mentioned George Floyd. And I said, how many unarmed black men do you think are killed every year by the police? He said, a lot. I said, give me a number. He said, I really have no idea. I said, just try to think about it. How it happened every day? Did it happen every week? Happen every month? What do you think? He said, okay, it probably happens twice a day. I said, twice a day you believe the police kill an unarmed black man? He said, yes. I said, so that's 2 times 365, that's 730. So you believe 730 unarmed black men are killed every year by the police? He said, probably around that number. And I said, well, there was and I went into the policemag.com thing that you guys heard me talk about many times. I said, there's a website called policemag.com where they ask people who self-identified as very liberal, as you just said you are. He goes, that's right, that's me. And they were asked, how many unarmed black men did the police kill in 2019? I said, half of them answered 1,000, which is more or less what you said. He said, that's right. And I said, 8% thought they killed 10,000. As far as just self-described liberal people are concerned, I said, 39% thought the police killed 1,000 unarmed black men in 2019, and 5% thought they killed 10,000. Now, the actual number, according to the Washington Post database, was 12. He said, well, that's the Washington Post. They're pro-Trump. I said, the Washington Post is pro-Trump? I said, the owner is Jeff Bezos. He's not a conservative. He said, well, he gave money to the Trump inauguration. I said, well, okay. Assuming that he's now suddenly a pro-Trump guy, the number that they gave in 2019 was given before Bezos gave the money to Trump. So I suspect it's still a valid number. He said, well, you're just trying to win an argument. He said, we're two men, we're competitive, we're trying to win. I said, I'm not trying to win anything. I'm just telling you that you are wrong, wildly wrong. And if you are happy being wildly wrong about how often the police killed an unarmed black person, then have at it. I'm just telling you that you are wildly wrong. And he said, well, why are we having an argument? I said, I don't consider this to be an argument. I said, you made a statement. I had a choice to ignore it. I had a choice to agree with it, or I had a choice to respond to it. And I'm responding to it. And it just seems to me, if I'm an intelligent human being, if I am dead wrong about something and you are dead wrong about this, I'd like to know about it. He said, well, you probably know a little bit more about this than I do. And then we switched the topic and started talking about basketball. But this, again, is a self-described, very liberal person having no clue about how often the police kill an unarmed black person. I didn't even go into the fact that the police kill more unarmed white people. I didn't think he could handle that. Perfectly intelligent guy, didn't ask him what he did. And here he is, just confidently asserting how vicious and nasty and essentially systemically racist the police are. No frigging clue whatsoever. And I suspect that this is how he thinks about all sorts of issues. But again, we didn't get into that because we switched the topic after he felt so uncomfortable about what I said. I mean, this is it. These are the kinds of people who believe that Donald Trump mocked a disabled reporter. These are the kind of people that believe Donald Trump said about dead World War I vets buried in France that they were suckers and losers. This kind of person who believes that Donald Trump in 2017 about Charlottesville said there were good Nazis and bad Nazis on both sides. Kind of people who believe that Donald Trump said, in order to combat COVID, drink bleach. Completely, totally ill-informed about this issue. And I said to him, I said, I'm sure you believe this with the best of intentions because you feel for what you consider to be the plight of black people. And I said, and I get that. I just you're just wrong, incredibly wrong. And then, we went back to the basketball game, as I mentioned.
For full shows, live and on demand, it's Salem News Channel.